I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the chairs of the Socialist History Society, and we're really pleased to have Glyn, who is speaking about his book, Riding Two Horses, Labour in Europe. Despite the title, actually, it's a full autobiography, so it covers a lot of things in Britain and a lot of things in the rest of the world as well as Europe. So in many ways, don't be misled by the title, but it's probably the most detailed study of Labour MEPs and the activities within the European Parliament. So it's actually a very good read, unlike some books which cover similar subjects, I have to say. Glyn's going to talk for about 45 minutes, no slides, so you can watch him and listen to him carefully. And then we'll have lots of time for questions and comments afterwards. So as we said, please put yourself on mute. When we get to question time, you can either do the hand up on the reactions, or if you're on video, wave at me and I will try and catch you. Glyn's also said, and I hope the publisher's happy with this, that members of the Socialist History Society can have a copy of this for £10, and we'll put a link to how to obtain that on our website after we've finished. So welcome, Glyn, over to you.
Thank you. I think one of the publishers is actually listening, so if he beats me up in questions, you'll know he doesn't agree with me. I mean, so I was 25 years in the European Parliament. I used to joke you got less time for murder in the UK, and served from 1984 through to 2009 when I lost my seat. It's a very personal history, and I'm going to talk about what I was doing, but I think it has some relevance more generally for, if you want, socialist history in the United Kingdom, in Europe, and maybe even slightly further afield. While I was an MEP, we were largely ignored by the British press. I remember I did a report on racism, and the Guardian printed a full-page analysis of it, but it was actually reprinted from a Danish newspaper, which I find rather strange. They picked this thing up from a Danish newspaper, not realizing it was actually something done by a British member of the European Parliament. I contributed both to the failures and successes of what I was doing. On a number of occasions, it was clearly my fault what actually happened rather than other people's. I do remember a number of incidents. Having been an MEP, I managed to speak to 250,000 people in Paris in the Place de la Concorde on an anti-racist platform of Touche pas mon pote against Le Pen in the 1980s. And I also, towards the end of my career, did 100,000 people in Alexandra Park in London, which was the 25th anniversary of the Rock Against Racism march. I learned about skinship. I was invited by the Japanese deputy prime minister to actually share a bath with him, and discovered that this is something that you do not say no to. This is an extremely high honor, especially for a Gaijin, a foreigner. After kinship, skinship is the closest relationship you can have in Japan. And sometimes you have to be careful how hard you push things. I'd been working on animal welfare issues, and I demanded, when I went to Beijing, to see the Forestry Commission, because they were responsible for animal welfare, to complain about the fact that they weren't doing enough to protect tigers, that they were allowing them to be killed and tiger parts to be used for medicine and in religious ceremonials and the rest. And the response was, well, we arrested 43 people last year and executed them. I sort of backed out of the room, sort of saying, I'm against the death penalty. So yes, be careful. I think to get into it, I need to talk a little bit about class and education. I come from a coal mining family in the Forest of Dean. My mother was one of 13 kids. All the family, apart from my father, were coal miners. My father was worked in tin metal and tool making. he was moved from the Forest of Dean to across the river to the Cotswolds, to Stroud, near Stroud, where he worked for Ransom Hoffman Pollard, making ball bearings for Spitfires. I passed one of only 2 boys out of 40 from my local primary school to a grammar school. When I got there, it was all Harold Wilson's fault. Harold Wilson was talking about the white heat of the technological revolution. And so I signed up for maths, physics and chemistry at A level, and then went off to the British Aircraft Corporation as an undergraduate apprentice, a 131 apprenticeship. You worked a year for the British Aircraft Corporation. You then had 3 years at university, and you were then guaranteed a year back. We were working on the TSR-2, which was a failed military fighter. It could get to Mach 2.8 or whatever it needed to get to, but when it landed, it would need new engines, which seemed to me to be not a technological success. On the other hand, we were working on Concorde, which was a technological dream, but an economic disaster. We did not anticipate the oil price rises in 1973. The result of all that was I had a background in science and technology, but I was also involved in politics. My parents were cogs in the machine. I don't even think they were on the party, on the CLP, but they were active members of the Forest of Dean and then Stroud Labour parties. And so I was brought up. I was collecting money down our streets in the 1950s, a penny a week for the Labour Party. When I got to Reading, that's where the university I went to, I did maths, chemistry, geology. And I picked geology just for something different. Most people did physics. And that was the first of my if you want, my retreat, my partial retreat from Harold Wilson. Geology was going through a very interesting intellectual revolution at the time, plate tectonics. It was continental drift. It was all very exciting, and chemistry was extremely boring, which is what I was supposed to be doing for the British Aircraft Corporation. The result of which, Reading had a funny system. You did 3 subjects for 2 terms, and you chose. And I chose geology over chemistry, and therefore potentially no job over working for the British Aircraft Corporation. My parents were not entirely happy at that. And then I went off from Reading to University College London, where I did oceanography. And then, as a further retreat from Harold Wilson, went to Manchester to do science and technology policy. I amalgamated my science and politics together and got very much engaged in the radical science movement. Science for the People, British Society for Social Responsibility in Science. And in the Department of Liberal Studies in Science at Manchester, we had a Marxist reading group, and we were probably the only Marxist reading group that was going through Anti-Dorin and Dialectics of Nature. I have to say, those are, out of the Marx, Engels, Lenin tomes, as the ones I've tackled, they're probably the 2 most boring. I am happy to be challenged on that. And politically, while my parents were in the Labour Party, I had a foray into the Independent Labour Party, which was having a brief revival in the 70s, some of which is written up in the book. I think I was taken there by George Orwell. Homage to Catalonia probably got me into the ILP, and I was there on the National Administrative Council for a period of time up until 1984. I was also a Tameside councillor. I was elected for Tameside in East Manchester. We regularly got applications from people who said they wanted to live near the Thames. They didn't tend to get employed by the local council. I stood in 1976 and lost, and I was elected in 78 and then re-elected in 82. I don't know whether any of you remember, but Tameside Council was very famous. The Tories took control in 76 when I stood for the first time, and they reversed the plans to go comprehensive that were due 5 months later. They did their own selection in the local solicitor's office, and there are a whole series of court cases and the rest. So Tameside had a certain fame. I was the chair of the Environmental Health Committee initially when we got control in 79. We got control the same day Labour lost the general election. I followed my radical science background and co-opted a radical science expert onto the Environmental Health Committee, where we dealt with all of the health hazards around, as well as mass graves. After the Environmental Health Committee was responsible for digging mass graves after a nuclear war. We did film censorship as well, and I had an interesting combat over a series of films where I thought The Life of Brian was going to get banned, but we managed by 5 votes to 3 to stop that from actually happening. I then the following year, became chair of education. I introduced a series of primary French, girls' science, which again was one of the things the radical science movement did, Russian, Japanese, and Arabic into the sixth form colleges, and we abolished corporal punishment. I had a couple of interesting set twos with James Anderson, the famous Chief Constable of Manchester. One of the schools, to be provocative, invited him to speech day. So I banned it as chair of education. We got a lot of bad publicity. Another school subsequently invited him. In the meantime, we discovered that we actually could set the date of the event. So he phoned his office to find out when he was available, and therefore when he wasn't available, set a date when he wasn't available, and we got away with not having James Anderson without the bad publicity. I was invited around then to do a lecture tour. Well, I asked the British Council to fund me to go to India for a conference. They said, if you go on to Japan afterwards, because we're desperate to find somebody to actually do some lectures on science and technology policy. And my response was, that's fine if I can go to the USA after Japan. So we did a deal. And I was at Tokyo University for 5 months. It was 5 months because I could only be away as a local councillor for 6 months without losing my seat. And there I got involved with some of the far left of the Japanese Socialist Party, and was on a Sink Nakasone rally, and was there when Chukakaha, which was the middle core faction, attempted to send a petrol tanker into Narita Airport and blow it up. The Japanese left were fairly violent at the time. I subsequently met some of them in North Korea. Maybe we'll get back to that. In 1984, I was selected as a candidate for the European elections. I was selected in fundamentally Tameside, Stockport, and Oldham. I stood basically because someone said, "Well, you do a lot of traveling abroad. Why don't you stand?" I got 2 nominations, and in total, there were 7 on the shortlist, and I was lucky I got it on the 4th ballot. We were all anti-European. I was in the Labour Common Market Safeguards Committee, but subsequently a number of people said, we voted for you because you're the least anti-European. We had no expectation of winning. 2 reasons. Labour in the 79 elections had only won 17 seats. And in fact, somebody had, a minor had defected to the SDP. And so we were down to 16 seats. The problem is Labour couldn't add up. We were told that our seat was number 39 on the list, which looked a long, long way down. It turned out they'd done their maths wrong, and we were more like about 32nd. And I was one of the people who came through. We won 32 seats in that election. I didn't have the lowest majority, but I think there are only 2 lower majorities than me. I'd been regularly mentored by Janie Buchan. At the time in 79, it was a Labour right that actually had control of the, it wasn't called this then, but I used the term European Parliamentary Labour Party, with Barbara Castle in control. Janie was my mentor, probably because I was a reasonably regular writer for Tribune, so I was picked out as being on the left. After the elections, we got summoned to a caucus meeting beforehand. I think there are probably about 19, 20 of us out of the 32, and we went through the whole list of officers and voted in the caucus meeting between the various candidates. It was decided to leave Barbara Castle in place for a year, but that Elf Lomas would take over as deputy, and the rest of the slate was adopted. We then dutifully all went off from our caucus meeting round the corner to Queen Anne's Gate, where the European Parliament had its office, and then went through the same process amongst the 32, where we voted down all of the right-wing candidates in favour of the left, and as I said, leaving Barbara Castle there. We formed ourselves into a broad left. It was basically the campaign group plus Tribune, and that was 20 out of the 32. So we were in control. The problem was that if you want, the way I put it, and this is my version, there are very different versions as well. The campaign group decided, or some of the campaign group decided, they wanted to be very fundamentalist on the position on Europe. Bob Cryer, Les Huckfield were two of the leading figures in this. There was discussion about leaving the socialist group. We were in the socialist group in the European Parliament. It was almost a proto-European research group, as the Conservatives later wanted to leave their natural home in the European People's Party. I'd started to have some concerns about the policy on Europe. I took the view, obviously, it was shaped by my time in Japan. There I was working on science and technology policy. Japan at the time was one of the leading countries in the world in terms of the economy. And around the time I was there, it actually briefly overtook the United States as the most powerful economy in the world. And it seemed to me, looking the long distance from Tokyo back to Europe, that medium-sized nation states on their own weren't doing very well. And it seemed to me that while there might have been an alternative to actually joining the European Union, once we were deeply in it, it was probably the best place to organise. And a group of us within the Tribune group, David Martin, Carol Tong, and myself, if you want, started to move to a position of being more pro-European. We anticipated the Laura's speech to the TUC by a few years. We wrote in December 1986. We did a piece in Tribune in which we talked about the campaign group as being the Japanese. There were around the time the last Japanese from World War II had come out of the jungle in Guam. And so we used the analogy that the trouble with the campaign group is they're like that Japanese in Guam. They don't realize that the war is actually over. The result was that in 1987, David Martin replaced Alf Lomas as leader. It was 17 votes to 15. It was extremely tight. And it was there was some brutal battling going on. 1988, Martin was replaced by Barry Seal, 17 votes to 15. The swing vote was Richard Belf, that man of the hard left, who's now a Conservative peer in the House of Lords. In '89, I stood we went from 32 seats to 45. And I stood as leader and was elected with the support of the Federalist Four, Ken Coates, Peter Crampton, Ian White, and Henry McCubbin, who were on the hard left, but they were pro-European. The changes were that there were no more separate whips, unless there was a special exception. Up until then, we'd had a separate whip on all occasions for all votes in the European Parliament. Now we joined with the Socialist group. We fully engaged with the Socialist group in all ways, and that obviously made a big difference to the perceptions of us inside the Parliament. But the atmosphere was pretty toxic inside the European Parliamentary Labour Party. Janie never forgave David Martin and myself for our apostasy in actually changing our position on the EU, and she would regularly regale visitors in our presence, saying that she was writing a book, Shits I Have Known, and these two are in it. And of course, the problem was that the consequence was that, in my view, nationalism trumped socialism, because we got to a position in towards 1983-4, where on one occasion I had a report on say no to Star Wars, and two members and in the plenary, 2 members of the campaign group didn't vote in favor of that position, and we lost by 2. It was personal and political. Subsequently, there was a concern by the campaign group that we were the false left, and we were deceiving people. And so the result of that was in 1993, Michael Hindley and John Tomlinson, Michael Hindley from the campaign group, John Tomlinson from the hard right of the Labour Party, got together. It's reported not in my book, but in a book by Anita Pollock, who was an MEP at the time, got together and agreed to vote for Pauline Green, who was a very pleasant but right-wing candidate to replace me. The danger was that they thought David Martin and myself were perfectly capable of becoming leaders of the Socialist group or even presidents of the Parliament, and us false lefts had to be stopped from that. So we were voted out. The EPLP, in my view, had a moment of importance, not particularly because of us, but there was this period from 84 to 94 in which we were one of the main battlegrounds about political issues inside the party. It then collapsed into a kind of cereal box of people going to the European Parliamentary Labour Party meetings and ended up picking up minor honours, MBEs, OBEs, and a rash of people going to the House of Lords. But politically, it became fairly insignificant. My experience was that out of the Labour leaders, the most genuinely pro-European was Neil Kinnock. Most people would normally attribute that to John Smith. That was not my experience. I was the leader both under Kinnock and under Smith. Kinnock was, Smith was a voyeur. He was pro-European, but he wanted to watch from the outside, whereas Kinnock wanted to get involved. He wanted to engage. And there was a real prospect at one time of him becoming head of what is now the Party of European Socialists. It all fell apart at the last minute. So I think that Kinnock is, in as much as you're looking for pro-European leaders and pro-engaged leaders in Europe, Kinnock was the one who actually did that. Problem with Blair, he was pro-European, but he had a lot of political capital, which he spent very badly. He spent his political capital on Iraq rather than on the single currency or other areas. And he's certainly a lost opportunity. The whole revision around the European Union and the Lisbon Treaty and the rest was all designed to actually create a kind of president of Europe position for Blair at the time. Blair would have been acceptable to both the left and the right, but of course Iraq was what killed it for them. Under Kinnock, he agreed that MEPs would have votes in the leadership contests, which made us sought after, at least on occasion, that we'd have a place on the shadow cabinet and on the departmental teams. My view of Brown was not encouraged when I went. I had a 64-page economic policy paper presented to the Shadow Cabinet, in which he did an economic policy paper that managed not to mention the European Union on a single occasion. That takes some doing in terms of economic policy. I was the foreign affairs spokesman when Gulf War II started, and I was then, because I've been replaced as leader by Pauline Green, on the Foreign Office team. And so we would go for weekly briefings. It was always difficult for me to get there, but we would have weekly briefings of the junior ministers, the Labour Party International Secretary, and the rest. And for months, people were pleading and pleading for something to provide for the backbenchers to actually convince them of the merits of a war in Iraq. And eventually, of course, we got the dodgy dossier, which was based on a 13-year-old sort of master's thesis or whatever it was, which took us in entirely the wrong direction. I resigned as foreign affairs spokesman at that point. I couldn't live with myself, and so I stood down. I was very rapidly replaced, and was suitably punished after the 2004 European elections, when I was asked by several of my socialist colleagues, non-British, to actually be the socialist spokesman on foreign affairs. It just happened by some coincidence that we couldn't get more than one place on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And of course, my replacement as the Labour Foreign Affairs spokesman had to take priority. The numbers were interesting. We had 19 seats at the time and got one place on the Foreign Affairs Committee. The Conservatives had 28 seats and got 4 places. So I suspect it was not maths that was actually my problem. Earlier, Jack Straw had made almost as bad a decision as they did over Iraq with respect to proportional representation. In 1990, there has always been pressure on Labour to introduce PR for at least the European elections, because we were the only sizable country that didn't have PR. And so the results in the UK swung control of the European Parliament backwards and forwards in a massive way. We had 62 seats at one time, which we had in after 94, and we were down to 13 at 16 at another. So we actually were the controlling. We shifted the control of the Parliament. That clearly didn't make a lot of sense. But the plan was in 97 not to introduce PR. There was too much to do in terms of the agenda, because it had to be done before 99 and the next elections. But then the EPLP rejected the standing orders that had been accepted by the PLP. Blair had wanted to tighten up standing orders rather fiercely about bringing the party into disrepute, etc., and the European Parliamentary Labour Party narrowly rejected it, but rejected it did. The result was an instant decision in the Home Office, which is where Straw was at the time, that we were going to introduce the PR now for the European Parliament elections. I don't have a problem with PR. I supported it, but it was introduced in the most cack-handed way possible. What they did is they just took the English regions and said, fine, we'll deal with that. The result was in the northeast of England, there were 3 seats, and in the southeast, there were 11 seats. So that meant you had to get 25% of the vote to get a seat in the northeast and probably 5% in the southeast. But I was arguing that we should have 3 to 5 seats, regions, because of what happened there with those bigger regions, particularly the southeast and the southwest. We actually saw a breakthrough by Nigel Farage. 2 UKIP MEPs were elected and a Green. So we allowed them to be elected when we didn't need to. And the result of which was, if you want, the result of which was we opened the doors for Nigel Farage, for the Sun, to get on question time, to get in the Sun, to get on question time, and to get party political broadcasts and the rest. I don't say that apart from that accident of history, UKIP wouldn't have emerged, but they would have emerged later. and there would have been more of an opportunity to actually deal with the issues that were actually underlining it. So I think that Jack Straw is probably more the father of Brexit than Nigel Farage. My involvement, not that Straw would have minded very much. Straw was actually quite anti-European behind the scenes. My experience with Iraq took me off in two distinct but related directions. Firstly, North Korea. I'd always been marginally interested in North Korea, and the North Koreans came to see me in 1997 to say they had a famine, and would I get the European Union to actually send food aid? At the time, European Union officials were not allowed to speak to North Koreans at all. The result was I said I wanted to go to see the situation on the ground, and I went with two colleagues, two fellow MEPs, Clive Needle and David Emery, and we actually saw the situation, and I asked them if they wanted an official visit. They said, "Oh yeah." And so we came back and we tabled a very critical resolution about the situation in North Korea, and demanded that the North Koreans allow an official delegation to visit. Much to everyone's surprise, apart from mine, after this nasty resolution was sent to Pyongyang, the response was fine, come and visit. And so I then ended up in a process that's led me to visit North Korea now just under 50 times. And I'm engaged in a political dialogue with the Workers' Party of Korea, which is still ongoing, which was set up by Jonathan Powell and myself in 2010. The reason for the interest is I didn't want to happen to North Korea what happened to the Iraqis. The ordinary people of North Korea are just like us. And I was very concerned that they were exactly the same was actually going to happen. We've been dealing with the international secretary of the party. We've been through various international secretaries. My favorite was a man called Kang Suk-ju, who in the back of a car on the way to Bruges from Brussels told me that his favorite book was Gone with the Wind. I was then able to identify the report in the American press earlier that had said that one of the North Korean negotiators during the six-party talks had actually said, "Scarlet, I don't give a damn." So we know which North Korean actually said that. In North Korea, I met with the Red Army faction. Back in 1970, a section of the Japanese Red Army hijacked a plane to North Korea. They hijacked it in the name of a cartoon character called Barefoot Joe, who was a working class boxer who died in his penultimate fight in manga history. And yeah, nobody was hurt, nobody was killed, nobody was hurt in the hijacking. But when I was in North Korea, I was introduced to two of the remaining four hijackers and asked to see if I could persuade the Japanese government to allow them to return home. I was unsuccessful. That's a different story. But it was rather sad that Wakabayashi, who'd been the bass player for the cult rock band Les Rales Denudes, I do not recommend you listen to it. It could clear an auditorium in about 30 seconds flat, I reckon. It's sort of industrial punk of the most unmelodious kind that I've actually heard. He's there, and he's a Liverpool fan. Madly follows Steve Gerrard. So he's still stuck in North Korea 53 years after the hijacking. The second thing I did was to get involved with soft power in the EU. And I actually became the European Union's chief election observer for Indonesia in 2004. The European Union oversaw the first peaceful transition of power in Indonesian history when Megawati Sukarno was replaced by SBY. In 2004. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim state. and the fourth largest country in the world. We had 1,300 staff on the ground actually monitoring elections throughout Indonesia, which covers 5 different time zones. I mean, it goes all the way from Australia to India. Literally, the far tip of Aceh is about 60 kilometers from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and at the other end, you're very close to Australia and Papua New Guinea. I won't go into details; we're running out of time. But that was impressive. What was most impressive about it is we actually helped this peaceful transition of power, spending 4.5 hours spending in Iraq. It was about 4 million euros. That at the time, that was 4.5 hours spending on the Iraq war. I then went back as the chief election observer for Aceh. Aceh was the northern province of Indonesia, where a civil war had been going on for 30 years. And there'd been an attempt to try and resolve that issue, which was encouraged very much by the aftermath of the tsunami and Boxing Day 2004. And the European Union normally does not observe local and regional elections, but in this case, we were asked specifically to come in. GAM, who were the rebel group, and the government of Indonesia could only agree on the EU. They wouldn't agree on the United States. They wouldn't agree on other people. The EU alone was volunteered. We put in a military mission first, and when I went in to take over for the election observation, I was asked by Peter Faith, who was head of the Aceh monitoring mission before I came in with the European Union EOM, whether I wanted to keep the snipers on the roof. I turned down the snipers. But again, we helped end a 30-year-long civil war for less than 1 hour spending in Iraq. Indonesia, what's not entirely happy with what's going on there in terms of some of the new legislation on adultery, Sharia law, and the rest. But fundamentally, we have a functioning democracy in Indonesia, and more importantly, the ceasefire and the situation in Banda Aceh and the Aceh provinces is actually held. We've not always been as successful. I also did election observation for the EU or the OECD in Haiti, Kenya, Cambodia, and the Ukraine. So yes, there are things to be learned. I need to probably get towards the end, but a few other things. I was involved with the STOA project, Science and Technology Options Assessment in the Parliament, where I proposed that we do a report on the control of political technology, and the result of which was a report that actually identified the 5 I's: United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, as basically spying on the world through the echelon system. It created a deal of fuss in the European Parliament, but there seems to be very quickly collective amnesia in that these things have to be rediscovered again. Edward Snowden was a heroic individual, but almost none of what he told us hadn't been told in the European Parliament report earlier, but nobody seemed to reference it. I was on the Security and Defence Subcommittee, looking at arms production, arms exports, and arms conversion. I had the view that if the European Union produced its own weapons, we could do it much more efficiently within a single market, and therefore we could do it with far less qualified scientists and engineers who could be spun off into new ventures rather than buying from the United States. I also chaired a committee of inquiry into the growth of racism and fascism in Europe, and a second committee of inquiry. I was the rapporteur. I discovered the first committee that being the chairman is quite pretty, but you don't have much control. The person who has control in the European Parliament is the person who drafts the report. So for the second committee of inquiry, I was the drafts person, and and we were looking into the likes of the Front National in France. I mean, when I was elected in '84, the fascists got 20 seats in the European Parliament. It was mainly the Front National with Jean-Marie Le Pen. It was also Mussolini's leftover Movimento Sociale Italiano, led by Giorgio Almirante, who'd been the chef de cabinet of the Minister of Propaganda in the Sala Republic, and a solitary representative from EPEN, which was the Greek party in favor of the colonel's regime. And so that's why we set up these committees of inquiry. Unfortunately, we were not as successful here as we were in Indonesia. I mean, we now have, out of the groups I mentioned, the Greeks have largely disappeared. It's true, but the Movimento Sociale Italiano has been replaced by the Brothers of Italy. And one of the sisters of the brothers, Meloni, is now the Prime Minister of Italy. And Marine Le Pen, who inherited the party from the Front National from her father, and has renamed it the National Assembly, the Rassemblement National, is leader of the opposition in the French Assembly and is thought to have a very good chance of winning the next French presidential elections. We did get legislation at the European level, which is a positive thing, but there's a long way to go. How would I sum this up? Lost opportunities. I mean, I think we could have done a lot with the British Labour group if some people hadn't prioritised nationalism over socialism, if left sectarianism had not been as bad as it was. Secondly, organisation. We needed to actually build control in the European Parliament, or opposition. When I was chairing when I was involved in the committees of inquiry on racism, fascism, I used the local government model in the United Kingdom, and we had pre-meetings of all the left MEPs. We even had volunteers from amongst the interpreters to do free interpretation. And so we would pre-prepare everything. We would go through the agenda like you do on local government and actually pre-prepare. We need to build that. There's an opportunity with the Lisbon Treaty where the European Parliament, although it's going through a rough time at the moment, actually talked about having a Spitzenkandidat. You'd actually select a candidate for president of the Commission. And so the Socialists would have a candidate, the Christian Democrats would have a candidate, and the party that got those seats, either alone or in a coalition, would actually have that post. That's the good thing, and that also is connected with what they call the transnational lists, the idea that for European elections, you should elect a number of people across the whole of the European Union, because they, of course, would probably be the people who are being recommended to actually be commissioners and the rest, so it will give a democratic legitimacy. Third issue would be global. I spent a lot of time involved with Japan. I was on the Japanese delegation for 25 years. I actually swapped staff with Japanese politicians. I would have staff working in their offices in Tokyo. They would have staff working in my office in Brussels. There are opportunities to actually build a global left. When Delors was around, you had, for the first time since 1947, you had socialists in power in Japan. Again, in 2009, you had the same thing. There was Europe, United States, and Japan all had progressive left-wing governments. There was opportunity there that was sadly missed to actually try and build something there, which has failed. Where do we go from here? Never step in the same river twice. I guess I'm obviously very pro-European. I think we made a mistake voting to leave, but I think any prospect of going back in the foreseeable future is extremely unlikely. We're not trusted in Brussels. There would need to be a double referendum to get back in with qualified majority, in my view. It's not going to be 52-48 or 53-47. There will need to be a 60% majority or whatever, both to open negotiations and to close them. And those negotiations will have no opt-outs on a single currency, or Schengen, or getting our rebate back, or probably only on the issue of democracy, because the rules for joining the European Union do not allow non-democracies to join. And with the House of Lords, you have a rather strong case that actually Britain doesn't fulfill the criteria. When we joined, it was a buyer's market. It's now a seller's one. Tom there had a point. The breakup of Britain may be our only way back in. And with that provocative comment, I'll leave it. We can take questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Glyn. So we should have half an hour or so for questions and comments. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, put your hand up under reactions on your screen, or just wave at me if you're on video.
How are we doing it? One at a time or two or three at a time?
One at a time, or we'll group them.
As you wish, I don't mind.
While we're waiting, actually, because nobody's put their hand up yet, can I just ask you, I mean, a lot of the book and what you said at the end then, Glyn, was about the factionism within the party and lost opportunities, factionism within the European group of Labour MPs. I mean, obviously some individuals achieve positions, and sharing commissions like you did wrote very useful reports. But can you sort of say, how did the Labour group in the European Parliament, can you say as a group what they achieved, which is positive and which we could be proud of?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was quite a lot we achieved. I mean, we were very active, and in a sense, it probably stopped the factionalism from breaking out too early in the miners' strike. And when we got elected, the miners' strike was on. We actually raised, and I've got the figures in the book, I mean, from just amongst the 32 of us, we raised over £70,000 for the miners. We contributed allowances and the rest for almost a year. We also passed a series of resolutions in the European Parliament supporting the miners. We were so successful that they actually abolished the system whereby you could do that. There was what they would call a topical and urgent debate. And the Labour group was famous for actually putting up support for striking miners and factory closures and the rest. And it was actually changed by the right wing of the Parliament subsequently to say that topical and urgent debate was only about human rights and foreign affairs. And so that was gone. The fact that we got on board, I mean, generally there were people who didn't like what our position was, but from the time I got elected, we were an integral part of the socialist group, and we're a very large part of the socialist group. So in that sense, people like Stephen Hughes did some heroic work over the social contract. I mean, we'd opted out. Thatcher and Major opted out of the social contract. What we did, I can say it now, was we abused the system. We argued that things like the Working Time Directive was actually a health and safety measure, which was not covered by the social contract. So we were able to get legislation through under health and safety that was effectively, if you want, Labour standards. Alan Donnelly did the report on German unification. Which was obviously very crucial. There was this decision after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, what happens? And Alan Donnelly was there. Carol Tongue did some very good work, and Ken Collins on environment. So, but we were able to do, those individuals were able to do that work because of our collective support. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do that if we'd been the originally Eurosceptic, deeply divided group off in a corner.
Okay, thanks. Christine Newman.
I can't hear anything.
No, she's trying to find her unmute button. Bottom of your screen, bottom left on your screen should be unmute.
Disappeared. Yeah, I wanted to know what Keir Starmer means by making Brexit work better than it is at the moment. Oh well,
I mean, I'm a member of the Labour Party. I'm going out canvassing tomorrow in Oldham. I'm not sure I have any enormous insight on that. Clearly, Brexit is the Tories. there was a support in the United Kingdom in a referendum, narrow support for what we would call a soft Brexit. We were told by various people we would not be leaving the single market, we would not be doing this, we would not be doing that. We ended up with a very hard, brutal Brexit, which has all the consequences we've got now. We could have taken a much milder approach. If I'm being generous to Keir Starmer, I would say what he's saying is that we're going to change the rules to have a much less confrontational Brexit, where we will keep a lot of the European Union standards. At the moment, there's a bill going through the House of Lords, I think, to abolish all European Union legislation, start again. So we would have to keep to some of those standards. That's what I assume that Keir Starmer is actually telling us. After the part of the deal in 2020 was that there would be a renegotiation after 5 years. Now, I don't really see Turkish voting for Christmas, so we're going to have Rishi here until January 2025. Almost as soon as after the election, and I've got my fingers crossed that we maintain our position, we're going to have a Keir Starmer government. One of the first items on their agenda will be a renegotiation of our relationship with Europe. I mean, that has to be done. I mean, there's no choice about it. It's been agreed. It's an international treaty. Of course, we could make very few concessions. We could demand to stay where we are, but there will be an opportunity there for Keir to do that. My own position is I'm in favour ultimately of rejoining, but it's got a long, long way down the line. There'll be a whole series of steps before then.
Okay.
Okay, who's next? Next question or comment? Otherwise, you'll get to my reserve questions.
Okay.
Somebody must have a comment. Right, Tony, the publisher, Tony Simpson.
Hello. Greetings from Nottingham. There's one of the fundamental consequences of leaving the European Union has been the loss of political representation within the European Union through the European Parliament. It seems to me that this is actually part of the decline in political debate and in general political conduct in Britain nowadays. I worked in Ken Coates's office for 10 years when he was a member from 1989 to 1999. And we did a lot of constituency work on the environmental consequences of what was happening in the old coalfield areas of Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. You know, the air pollution from open cast mining and the effects on children's health, the high incidence of asthma, that kind of thing. And we were able to ask the Environmental Commissioner what directives were relevant to this situation. And she was always constructive in her responses. Her name was Rip Bjerregaard. And we were able then, if we were persistent, to get the Commissioner to write to the UK government and ask for an explanation of why all these children were being made to swallow air that was making them ill. When Michael Meacher became Environment Secretary or Environment Minister under the Blair government after 97, he actually was very responsive on these questions, and we made some real progress. Well, that avenue is no longer open to us. So we now see sewage being, raw sewage being discharged into the sea in Cornwall. You know, really shocking discoloration. I know Glyn was himself a partisan of surfers against sewage, and perhaps still is. But I'd be interested in whether he has some observations himself about the political decline and what the actual engagement of the Labour Party is currently as a party with the Party of European Socialists. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, firstly, I mean, Ken Coates was one of them. And Tony, you're probably directly involved, but we also managed to use the Parliament to engage with ordinary people. It was Ken's idea to have the pensioners' parliament, and we ended up having 600 representatives, one for each MEP, actually coming to a 2-day parliament in Luxembourg. Then there was a youth parliament. So there was some real genuine engagement. And one of the ideas Ken had was, which didn't come to fruition, was the idea for a joint session of the European Parliament in the late 80s with the Supreme Soviet. So there was some there was a lot of very good stuff going on. I mean, we did get a special budget line, and it wasn't me that did it, in the EU budget to help with coalfield communities. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but there was actually an office and special money going in to repair the constituencies that had been damaged by coal mining and its closure. And some of which, a very small portion of which came to the Forest of Dean, where, if you want, my family had been coal miners before the Labour government closed the pits in the early 60s.
Okay, thanks. David Morgan.
I mean, sorry, the last.
Oh, sorry, finish, yeah.
I was just going to say, the Labour Party, of course, is still a member of the Party of European Socialists. That's a subsection in the sense of the Socialist International, which covers Europe. And they have congresses and the rest. I don't know whether Labour Party members here realise, but you are actually a member of the Party of European Socialists as well. The Labour Party headquarters doesn't like to advertise that too much. We could be much more active there, and we could be involved in the selection of the socialist candidate for the presidency of the Commission. There will be a Congress in the next 12 months to actually make that selection, and we're entitled to go there and vote. My understanding is that we sent people to the last Congress, but it was extremely low key with very little involvement. And certainly there were no reports back. One would hope that it would be much higher key, and that Starmer himself would go on occasion. Certainly, we've had the senior Norwegian figures that were not in the EU actually at those kind of events in the past when we were in the European Union.
Thanks. David Morgan.
Thank you, Glyn. That's very interesting. It takes me back to the 1980s when I was campaigning for Barbara Castle in Manchester. That's one of my first experience of the Labour Party. I've been dipping my toe in that water since about 1980, in and out. I'm actually sort of halfway out now again. The question I wanted to ask is regarding definitions. I mean, you've talked about hard left and socialism, unusual for a Labour spokesman today to use the S word. I would like to know what you mean by socialism, or what the Labour Party means by socialism. I remember attending a leadership rally, and Roy Hattersley was speaking, and he made the most pertinent point on this issue. He said socialism is not about equality of opportunity. It's about moving towards an equality of conditions. And I thought that was quite insightful for someone who's a centrist, but an intellectual in a way. I think the Labour Party now has lost its intellectuals. I think it's gone a bit barren. It's not fertile soil for intellectual debate like it used to be. The early Fabians, Keynes, even Crossland was an intellectual, wasn't he? You know, The Future of Socialism. I mean, everyone said it was a right-wing book, but it had interesting fertile ideas in it. Starmer was asked by Chris Mason the other day to say, he was asked quite a provocative question: what is the Labour Party for? And Starmer was like a rabbit in the headlights. You know, he didn't really know how to answer it. I've written down what he asked, what he said, what his response was. The point of Labour is to grow the economy. Oh, bloody hell, that's everyone. Every party wants to do that. There's got to be a bit more than that, surely. Maybe he didn't have time to think about it, but we should have some kind of vision. I think that's what's lacking with Labour now. It's not that it's right-wing or blah, blah, blah. It's that there seems to be the vision's gone of the old pioneers of Labour. Maybe you can comment on that. I didn't mention the Europe. I think the Europe's become under the wing of the United States now. Anyway, maybe that's because we've left here, but I don't think the two are related. Anyway, thanks for your talk, and it was quite stimulating.
Okay, Glyn, do you want to
I'm
respond?
not sure I can answer the question, what is socialism, in less than about half a day. All I can say is that I'm reasonably confident in my position, if you want. The two tests are in the book. There's an early leaflet of mine when I was standing for the local council, and the headline is "Vote for Socialism in Hurst." Back in those days, Labour Party's control was much less firm. You got selected as a candidate, and off you went, and you did your own thing.
What you want? Yeah.
These days, I'm sure that would not be allowed. In fact, I know
pretty
it.
sure.
In the last European elections that I stood in 2014, I got the Devon Labour parties to agree to fund an extra leaflet that was going to be an attack on UKIP. And we had to submit it to the regional office. The regional office said we couldn't produce it and distribute it because it was too powerful and it would drive people away from UKIP back to the Tories. There are a couple of there's a little bit of false consciousness in that. The idea that all UKIP supporters were coming from the Tories seemed to me to be a little naive. And actually, it was a PR election. So it was supposed to go to allow the Tories to actually win. I'm quite proud of the ability to work with people across the board. In 2014, I had endorsements for my candidature from Jeremy Corbyn and Jonathan Powell.
Okay, that's across the board. Certainly, Jonathan Powell was head of policy for Tony Blair, that those that don't remember. Okay, Steve Kushner's next, and then I've got Dawn Jansen. Steve.
First, just briefly to say something in defence of Engels' The Dialectic of Nature. Worth another read. I think it's one of his best, but that's neither here nor there, really. What I really wanted to ask about was, what do you think of the question of racism in the Brexit decision and the role of anti-immigrant British xenophobia? I mean, the refusal to join the Schengen Agreement seems to me, absolutely pandering to that kind of anti-immigrant xenophobia. And I see the Labour Party now still anti-immigrant, still calling for control on immigration, still has failed, apart from a few individuals, to contest the hostile environment of the Home Office, and so on. And I wonder what you think about that.
I tend to agree. I mean, firstly, in terms of the general public, it's partly our fault for not educating people about the European Union and what it did. I think I said there was very little press interest apart from John Palmer, who did an extremely good job, the Guardian's European correspondent, and Boris Johnson, who did an extremely bad job. Those are probably the only two journalists who are actively engaged with the European Union. I was campaigning in Cinderford, which is an old mining area in the Forest of Dean, around the time of the referendum, and I was knocking on doors, and people were saying, "I'm voting to leave because it'll stop all these packets coming." Firstly, I mean, free movement was not about third country nationals. That was an entirely separate problem, which would not be resolved in any way whatsoever by us leaving the European Union. But try explaining that to people who had this mentality. It was extremely difficult. Interestingly, now, of course, we've got 150,000 plus nursing vacancies. A lot of those vacancies, a lot of those empty spaces used to be filled by nurses from the European Union and outside. We've now realized that how much of the economy, both the public and the private economy, was actually being supported from people from third countries.
Thanks. Sorry, it's Linda rather than Jorn, isn't it? Linda?
Yeah, it is. It's me, actually.
Yeah.
You haven't said anything about the unions, because, of course, with the unions, we're all still part of the whole European labour movement. And there's big disputes going on all across Europe at the moment. And I mean, I'd still attend committees financed by the Commission, but they're the union-based committees. So, I mean, there's, of course, quite a close relationship in a way with Parliament.
Well, I mean, I was talking primarily about my experience. I was involved in the unions. I was very active both with Unite and with the GPMU. But I mean, as far as I'm aware, several of the unions actually had Brussels offices, and those have largely gone now. We did have.
I think the GMB still has one, yeah.
But there are a whole series of open Brussels offices. There were fairly senior British members of the ETUC, including John Monks when he left the TUC. I understand that we only have people in the ETUC now at a very low level. That may be for good reason or bad, but certainly I think we should be pressing the unions to continue that engagement. There still is a trade union intergroup in the European Parliament, I understand, but certainly I don't hear much about what happens, and I spend most of my time in Brussels. So if there is an active union, I'm sure there is, they could do with publicising the work they do, because it might help us sell the message that it's important to be engaged there. It's the European Union that set many of the standards that the Tories didn't like. Which is why that was one of the pushes for leaving, because European Union standards are too high.
Thanks. Right. Anybody else who hasn't made a comment to ask the question yet? Nobody waving? Nobody got their hand up? Right. Well, I just wanted to, oh yes, all right. Nebojsa Miličić.
Thank you for the presentation and opportunity to discuss. Well, as to say cultural Marxist, so I'm not engaged in working class movement from European periphery or wanna be European periphery. I mean, we are in Serbia and Belgrade, ex-Yugoslavia, we are at the periphery willy-nilly, but we are not formally integrated. I think that I wonder, like from the position of left wing of Labour Party, isn't there some sort of a theoretical insight that European Union is an anti-communist, historical anti-communist imperialist project? I don't think in terms of some conspiracy or something. This is the open like concept. To maintain the capacity and reproduction of European imperial economy, and to submerge, to submit, to make all, especially Eastern European economies that had some other chance during socialist period, just to make them like auxiliary economies that serve primarily German economy now, but all central capitalist economies. And then, you know, when I listen how your hopes were invested, to say, into the project in European parliamentarism, not to mention its totally anti-democratic character, I mean, and totally ignorant, let's say, administrative capacity from what we now see as a result of popular thinking, which became now populist politics. I mean, I just wonder, is there a position, an insight that would see in Brexit some sort of unwished but still opportunity to get rid of that historical project, at least conceptually, theoretically, if not politically? Politically, it will be very hard.
To answer that is a day's seminar by people far more intelligent than I am, but fundamentally you're right in the sense that the enlargement from the 15 to the 27 has led to, if you want, a distinct anti-communist, tone coming into the parliament, far stronger than is ever there before, in that sense. My problem is that I think the labour movement has to organise at the same scale that capitalism organises at. And I'm afraid that I think capitalism has gone beyond the medium-sized nation state. So if you want to control the levers of power, you have to tackle them where they are. And they're now in the United States, they're now in the European Union, they're now in China, whatever. And so we're forced to operate on that stage. Now, it may be a place we don't want to start from, but we don't have any choice. But I would argue that the European Union is not as bad as you're saying it. One of the reasons many people wanted to leave it was because it had too much of a social dimension to it, not because the British government, the British didn't leave the European Union because there wasn't enough equality, there wasn't enough protection. It's the reverse. So that was a better platform on which to organize. I disagree with the argument about democracy. I mean, the EU is and can be. I mean, the Lisbon Treaty gives us the space to create democracy. And it's interesting that the people who are most against the European Union, like the Tories, the ones that most resisted the moves towards democratization, like the electing at the European elections the president of the European Commission and effectively the commissioners through the Spitzenkandidat system. So I would disagree. It's not the most fertile ground, but it's the only ground we've got. We don't choose our battlegrounds. We have to fight on the ones we've got.
Okay. Any last questions from anybody else? Okay. I just really wanted to come back to this issue of where is the Labour Party in terms of international socialism? I mean, not just in Europe, but beyond. As Glyn commented earlier, you know, the level of Labour Party engagement with the Party of European Socialists has been at a relatively low level, not even at kind of shadow cabinet or ministerial level. Linda commented earlier on the lack of international trade union engagement, which I share her view that compared with 100, even 120 years ago, it appears to be pretty pathetic. To what extent is the Labour Party still engaging in a collective manner in the international socialist movement? Clearly the split in the Socialist International has not helped, but it does seem that, you know, the Labour Party at national level doesn't even report on international socialist conferences, and certainly the discussions on international, well, on foreign affairs, as we say, within the Labour Party more generally, don't seem to actually have any international socialist perspective whatsoever. I mean, do you want to comment on that, or am I being even more critical than you were?
Well, I mean, I think they're entirely right. I think the Labour Party, from what I can, it's not reported. And as I say, I spend a lot of my time in Brussels, and I follow this. I mean, there's the Party of European Socialists based in Brussels. You've got the European Parliament. You've got Party of European Socialists. You've also got FEPS, which is the which is the think tank. The Federation of European Socialist think tanks. Now, we could be engaged in all of those. I go to meetings in all of those, and we are not there. I understand that the Congress that was held recently, there was Labour representation, but it was very low key. I mean, we need to get involved. At all of these levels, we need to encourage the trade unions. We need to do it ourselves. If we are doing anything, we're not reporting. But it's exactly those are the kind of venues where we can prepare the ground for at least getting some more sympathy in terms of our renegotiations. That's where you can go to meet with the leadership of the socialist parties from around the European Union. And Keir Starmer should have been there.
Thanks very much, Glyn. And certainly, I mean, the last chapter of the book does set out Glyn's sort of perspective on the global situation and the role of the British socialist movement in the broader sense within it. So Tony Simpson, the publisher, has put in the chat how you get the book for £10 plus £2 postage. So go into the chat and take down Tony's email. And I thank Glyn for his talk. Just a couple of announcements for the Socialist History Society. I mean, those of you that aren't members, do join, go on the Socialist History website. For that, you don't just get all the notifications of our meetings, and we're doing a lot of them on Zoom at the moment. You will also get the Socialist History Journal, and I'm promised that the current issue has been printed and will be on the way to SHS members fairly soon. There is also the Socialist History Society newsletter, which is currently on our website. Our next two meetings, both on Zoom, Tony Grunstein on Zionism during the Holocaust, 19th of January at 7 p.m. and Greg Plays speaking on his new book on a utopia for a dying planet. So optimism in the context of dystopia, perhaps, on the 23rd of February at 7 p.m. We also get out to you a couple of pamphlets a year through our occasional publication series, and there's 2 or 3 that are being worked on at the moment. So thanks to everybody, and hope you're able to make one of our forthcoming meetings. Bye everybody, and thanks very much to Glyn for his presentation.